And before I introduce our eminent speaker, who is also a dear friend, Professor Lisa Wedeen, I wanted to say a few words about the title and the aim of the series that we're hosting at CHLA, the Critical Humanities for the Liberal Arts. The series holds a title of Futures Past, and it is concerned, to borrow from Freud, with what we could call civilization and its current discontents. So we've invited speakers from all over the world to Beirut to engage with our contemporary global condition that is characterized by crisis, a crisis in authority, which I think Lisa will address today, where we witness the rise of obscene figures of authority globally, an ecological climate catastrophe, ecological climate crisis, a more general exacerbation of social inequalities on a global scale. And all these crises are accompanied, on the other hand, or on the other side, by great advancements in technoscience that are also unprecedented, from automation to developments in AI to, I don't know, the James Webster telescope and space travel. And the question that the series kind of somewhat asks is, how can we be in times of such great possibilities but with increasingly dwindling horizons, right? This is kind of questions that we were hoping to raise in these lectures. And more importantly, how can the critical humanities help us address these complex and intertwined dynamics that are shaping and continue to shape our present? And also, what better place to think about alternative futures than Beirut, where the future keeps increasingly looking more and more like the past, if not worse. That's what is very interesting, kind of future anterior to this futures past term, which is coined by a philosopher of history, Reinhard Koselleck, and we borrow this term from him in the series, where there's this kind of collapse of horizons of expectations, although there's a kind of an accelerated sense of temporality. So this kind of very strange, uncanny effect that is evolving everywhere. And this idea that our present conditions, or our present increasingly looks like movies we have seen or already imagined to have seen in the past. This kind of uncanny sense. Dystopias, apocalyptic endings, imminent catastrophes, ecological wastelands, ruins of civilization. So this is kind of the, you know, the purview, the kind of the scope that the series hopes to address through the different speakers, and more crucially from the context of Beirut and Lebanon. So without kind of further ado, I want to say a few things about Professor Wedeen. Lisa is the Mary R. Morton Professor of Political Science and the College and co-director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory at the University of Chicago, the 3CT. She is also an associate faculty in anthropology. Her publications are numerous. I will include just the 3 books here. Her first book, Ambiguities of Domination, Politics, Rhetoric, and Symbols in Contemporary Syria in 1999, which was, I think, republished with a new preface in 2015. The book on Yemen, Peripheral Visions, Publics, Power and Performance in Yemen, and her last book, Authoritarian Apprehensions, Ideology, Judgment, and Mourning in Syria from 2019. Professor Wedeen's work is occupied with, if I may take the liberty to say just a few things here, with the inner workings of authority and ideology in the Middle East, and in particular and more generally as a global political theoretical problem. I can say that her last book, Authoritarian Apprehensions, if you haven't read it, you must, is perhaps one of the most incisive accounts of the affective and ideological procedures of the advancements of autocratic neoliberalism, a term that Lisa kind of renders somehow visible in the analysis that she carries out in the work. And most importantly, her work is not solely interested in the mechanisms of authority, which is what, I don't know, political theorists tend to be just concerned with that, but she is also foremostly interested in the impasses and failures of citizens to judge and question authoritarian rule, which, in a sense, she asks the really hard questions about ideology's relationship to failures and repetitions on the part of those who are, how do you say, experiencing authority. And she looks at these questions through very intriguing forays, through comedy, looking at sentimentality, affective investments, all kinds of mechanisms of disavowal. So, I mean, really a very singular analysis that Lisa provides for these mechanisms of autocratic neoliberalism. So today Lisa will speak to us about ideology, conspiracy, and the freedom to lie, Trump's America Revisited. So please join me in welcoming Lisa.
Thank you all for being here. I thoroughly appreciate it. I know that it's a big week for you at AUB, and so I am especially privileged to be able to talk to you. And thanks to Professor Nadia Abu Ali for that wonderful introduction, and also to the staff at CHLA, particularly Rami Shukur, for all you've done to make my visit so lovely. So thank you very much. Okay, now we have a little technical problem. Uh-oh. Hang on. Okay. Yeah, this is the start. No worries, thank you. So this is the first time I'm giving this talk, so bear with me. It's not going to be as polished as I like them to be, but you guys can then help me out too with sort of fruitful, kind, hopefully, criticism. So in 2016, Donald J. Trump, a Playboy real estate developer whose reality TV show helped propel him onto the national stage, was elected President of the United States, an outcome that left liberal election wonks aghast over the improbable victory of a clown and his constituency of white working class so-called deplorables. Undereducated men in the Midwest, South, and coastal suburbs of the United States, joined in many instances by their female counterparts, gave voice to their ressentiment. In electing Trump, they registered their disgruntlement with establishment politics as usual. Think terms like drain the swamp, while castigating what they regarded as woke progressives whose politics had weakened America by making it gay, black, socialist, feminist, communist, Mexican, Muslim, trans, you name it. If Ronald Reagan in the 1980s knew how to license misogyny, homophobia, and racism through a feel-good mythification of motherhood and a political demonization of others, Trump appeared as Reagan's revenant, the angry spectral return of the white man repressed. That Trump lost in 2020, despite his own claims to the contrary, does not mean that the Make America Great Again phenomenon has disappeared. On the contrary, Trump has made millions off of his electoral loss and subsequent indictment. His main competitor on the right, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, has established himself as a contending Tea Party darling by gutting the education system in Florida, banning books by the dozens, including classics for children by Dr. Seuss. Abortion rules in some places have become so draconian that women are being forced to give birth to children they do not want, even in cases sometimes of an unviable fetus. It's become easy and not unreasonable to conjure nightmarish visions of a theological state emerging along the lines of Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale. Finally, thanks to reactionary readings of the Second Amendment by powerful lobbying groups like the NRA, gun rights include the right to bear assault rifles, imperiling ordinary citizens in their daily lives, including schools. An atmosphere of bristling uncertainty and fragility is palpable in the United States these days, often anodyne referred to as polarization. Now, Trump's success can be read through the sociological analytic of class-based antagonism, and equally through a more mainstream focus on party politics, where we see a different set of party structures on the two sides, giving rise to the current generation of far-right politicians in the Republican Party, even as gatekeepers filter out progressive candidates among the Democrats. Here, in contrast, I'm going to center my analysis on three interrelated discursive affective phenomena without which I want to argue Trumpism cannot be adequately explained. As some of you know, much of my work has been on forms of autocracy in Syria and Yemen, but today I'm going to use what I've learned in the Middle East analytically to de-provincialize the region, and I take that word from Yassin al-Hajj Saleh, who took it from Joachim Haberlein, but really I think they both were inspired by Dipesh Chakrabarty's provincializing Europe. But in any case, I'm going to de-provincialize the region, I hope, by taking the United States as a case in point for our understanding of authoritarian politics. The Trump phenomenon enables thinking theoretically about a number of abiding concerns in politics, about ideology, conspiracy, and the freedom to lie. And the structure of the talk is basically based on these three rubrics. So we're going to start with ideology here. Inspired by Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson, my account of ideology is an effort to repurpose the term for the present. And it turns on the dialectical relation between form and content. Ideology operates in this formulation through seduction, arousing fantasy content while simultaneously diffusing it and smoothing out contradictions. It helps manage collective anxieties and socio-political incompatibilities by providing mechanisms that allow dissonances, to be contained, displaced, and disavowed. And I'm going to deal with these three fundamental aspects of ideology's form separately. As containment, ideology operates by making what are essentially social and historical anxieties seem natural and inevitable, gratifying desires largely to the extent that they are kept in check. This is what Frederick Jameson termed a fantasy bribe. And in a Trumpian political universe, that bribe functions rhetorically by arousing white supremacist feelings of solidarity while smoothing out or managing white working class discontent. Ideology also works through displacement. It allows unbearable fears to be relocated onto a new object, allaying anxieties by displacing them onto displacing unacceptable attributes or ordinary worries onto a fantasy other. In a Trumpian world, this means directly attacking Muslims or blacks or indigenous people, or in one specific instance of Trump fear-mongering, calling Mexican immigrants rapists, or on countless occasions referring to COVID as the so-called China virus. And ideology operates as disavowal. The theorist Octave Manoni noticed how people would rationalize their lives, acknowledging and disavowing simultaneously. The phrase, "I know very well and yet nevertheless," exemplifies this mode of disavowal, a distancing from accountability that has implications for politics. In the case of Trump supporters in the United States, disavowal typically worked like this. I know very well that he shouldn't be saying racist things, but it is funny. Or, I know very well that he lies, but politicians never tell the truth. Or, I know very well that he said those lewd things about women, but it's just locker room talk, and boys will be boys. And lest we think this mental sleight of hand is unique to Trump's constituencies, in capitalist societies more generally, we tend to practice disavowal all the time. I know very well that ordering packages from Amazon exploits already precarious workers, but in a pandemic I need my mask as quickly as possible. Or maybe it's a book that has to be delivered in time for class. Or I know very well that the Trump presidency is the result of a deep flaw in our institutions of democratic governance, and yet everything will be different if we can just get Biden into office. You can fill in ample examples from the Lebanese experience as well, of course, from feminists engaging in cosmetic surgery to the forms of enjoyment we all participate in spite of the surrounding suffering. In this sense, disavowal expresses the contradictions it simultaneously repudiates. It goes beyond denial in that it poses the problem it then works to dismiss. In sum, in the cultivation of citizen attachments, ideology matters. It doesn't demand outright belief, but works complicating matters of belief and unbelief so that people can know things and not know them at the same time. Ideology might generate ardent loyalty, but just as effectively cultivate ambivalence. And a certain ambivalence among Trump followers allows them to toggle between desires for a radical undoing of politics as usual and their compensatory attachment to a mythic order of former greatness. In this way, ambivalence was instrumental in bringing a populist authoritarian figure to power in the United States. Now, it's clear by now that I'm not using the term ideology as it's often been used in my deeply troubled discipline of political science to refer to a party platform or a distinct doctrine anchoring sincere or otherwise powerful beliefs, although ideology can certainly be recognized in political documents. Instead, following a cultural Marxist tradition, I take ideology to refer to embodied, affectively laden discourses that are conveyed in any number of ways, including acephalously through everyday activities. Ideology is understood in this way as not simply content, but also form. Ideology operates both as a set of ideas to which individuals are committed and through the identifiable material and structuring effects it has on political and social life. It operates in all kinds of ways in films, literature, comedy skits, the production of fake news, advertising, and in people's affective investments toward hierarchy, conflict, and political justification. And again, it isn't just the way that cultural production produces identifiable ideological content, but that the content works in the service of a form that has political effects, smoothing out inconsistencies, displacing fears onto a phantasmatic other, and enabling disavowal that I know very well and yet nevertheless of our political existence. What we see here, as Louis Althusser was at pains to make clear, is the way that ideology is inscribed in material practices and the ongoing, often banalized behaviors that make us all complicit in upholding a system, indeed in finding enjoyment in a system despite its dependence on concrete forms of late and post-industrial exploitation. Our complicity in the system consists in its reliance on us to bracket our knowledge of how the satisfying of our desires entails the suffering of others. But I want to go even further than this. Marx wrote in Capital, as many of you know, about commodity fetishism, and he says that people, quote, do not know it, but they are doing it, unquote. Now, this may well sound like a false consciousness argument, which most of us would want to repudiate. The reason following Zizek and Benoni I quoted here is to focus specifically on knowledge as part of ideology. They know very well, and yet nevertheless they're still doing it. That's Benoni, and doing it, ordering books from Amazon or working through civil society organizations that uphold the system or bemoaning climate change while continuing to contribute to ecological disaster is what counts politically, and that's Zizek's main point. I want to add two more permutations to our understanding of disavowal, to our understanding of I know very well, and yet nevertheless. First, they do not know that they know very well what they then disavow. That's another possibility. So I'm going to repeat that one. They do not know. So instead of they know very well and yet nevertheless, they do not know that they know very well what they then disavow. And second, they know it and they do not know it at the same time. The first version suggests the possibility that people might learn by processes of attunement to see what is already in plain sight and acknowledge and correct for it. The second requires recognizing incoherencies in ideology, the result of our desires coming into conflict with our knowledge. It requires recognizing that knowledge is never independent of affective investments and that affective investments themselves can be contradictory. Rather than resolve these contradictions or think of affect and cognition as fundamentally separate, we need to live and theorize the contradictions, thinking dialectically in ways that allow us to grasp not only the messiness of political life, but therefore the multiplicity of challenges to transformation. So, for example, when Thomas Franks asks, "What's the matter with Kansas?" in that famous book, basically as a way of asking why working class Americans from the Midwest vote against their interests by voting Republican, the question is itself badly framed. It assumes that our interests are somehow coherently related to one another, when in truth they often are not. It also assumes that affective investments and cognitive interests can be neatly disentangled from one another. We want the state and we don't want it at the same time. Or we want aspects of the state but not others. We can take pleasure in sentimental fictions while also being repulsed by the power they have to manipulate us. I love Crash Landing on You, for example. I can't stop listening to the music, and I find it repulsive that I can't stop listening to the music. We can worry about consuming too much water and also want green parks. Trump's brazenness can be a source of fascination, even a kind of repugnant admiration, a point to which I'll return. But before I do, I want to think more specifically about Trumpism's appeal in the context of global conditions of conspiracy theorizing. So the second part of the talk is about conspiracy. So to our contemporary world of information, oversaturation, disinformation, and pressing problems of political judgment, mainstream media had to a great extent responded by announcing the arrival of a new golden age of conspiracy theory. Now, of course, conspiracy theories come in many varieties, appealing unevenly to the addressees who become aware of them. Most generally, a distinction can be made between conspiracy theories that are outrageous and yet are circulated and perhaps believed by some people invested in the views and fantasies undergirding the particular narrative, and those that appear more or less plausible because they speak to long-standing structural inequalities or can be proven in retrospect to be true. During my fieldwork in Syria, some of the regime-oriented conspiracy theories were so preposterous that their very absurdity served as a mechanism of social control, showing how flagrantly fictitious statements work as mechanisms for citizen management in many authoritarian circumstances. Through hyperbole and outright lying, authoritarian regimes are able to enforce obedience by sowing confusion, polarizing publics, and cultivating widespread political despondency among citizens forced to constantly address the very thing they want to dismiss. As the anthropologist Joseph Mascow has shown, and as I suggested at the start of this talk, it's not only autocracies that make use of political strategies we think of as authoritarian. And the following points are ones that we make, Joe Mascow and I, make together in a new book we co-edited entitled Conspiracy/Theory, coming out with Duke University Press in 2024. The national, or the U.S. national security state also functions by manipulating citizens' perceptions, emotions, and imaginations, in large part by fomenting images of dangerous others, with the result that a vast range of political and military projects are undertaken that could not be pursued through formal democratic means. Nor, of course, do state-organized narratives have any monopoly on using conspiracy theory to politically demonize vulnerable vulnerable others, with white supremacist accounts of immigrant crime in Western Europe and the United States providing just one prominent example. What looks very much like a conspiracy theory might also be deployed for salutary reasons as opposed to politically demonizing ones, such as when political activists warned of a new COINTELPRO surveillance in the aftermath of 9/11. Plausible and not so plausible, offensive and admirable accounts of important events frequently require a degree of connecting the dots by rendering complex and confusing appearances coherent or revealing patterns that have hitherto eluded big picture scrutiny. Conspiracy theories can appear to be plausible and sometimes turn out to be true because of the way they speak to long-standing structural conditions of oppression or persistent asymmetries of power. Big pharma experiments come to mind. Think the Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States or a host of vaccine trials in Africa and India. Not to mention, of course, the CIA, Mossad, and Saudi or Russian intelligence busily planning assassinations behind the scenes. As a term, conspiracy theory has a surprisingly short history in the English language, originating in the context of Cold War politics in the mid-20th century United States. Despite its brief history, however, as an accusation, it has always played an outsized role in policing what counts as acceptable modes of political discourse. Accusing ideas of amounting to conspiracy theory once again, despite its critical cases proving correct, have been key to maintaining and regulating inequality, militarism, white supremacy, and geopolitical hegemony in the United States. It has been official CIA policy since 1967, for example, to label people criticizing federal policy decisions conspiracy theorists as a method of patrolling speech and undermining critics. Conspiracy theory has also become a literary genre, appearing as a narrative form with entertainment value across print, film, television, and the internet. As an accusation, it operates in support of multimodal forms of information warfare as a means of spreading disruptive information for political advantage or fostering subversive counter-institutional pleasures, or purely and successfully for profit. My account of disinformation campaigns in the Middle East allows me to press two key points in this respect, more generally. First, and this is the less novel of my two claims, I must fess up, the combination of chronic uncertainty and information overload can induce people to seek out opinions reaffirming their own, and this tendency towards balkanization can lead to polarization. Internet users, taking an oft-used contemporary example, tend in any case to isolate themselves into echo chambers, relishing the sound of the stories they're telling themselves anyway, and the stories they tell themselves about the stories they tell themselves. An atmosphere of uncertainty in the presence of too much information reinforces the tendency so that siloed publics confine themselves to narrow communities of argument, allowing interlocutors the pleasure of encountering exclusively views that confirm their own. Second, in conditions of generalized uncertainty, our current conditions of epistemic murk, people find it easy to generate alibis to avoid making political judgments at all. So on the one hand, we have polarization, and on the other hand, we have a confusion that leads to political paralysis. Information oversaturation, perhaps especially when feelings of present danger extrude a remainder of surplus threat, to borrow Brian Masumi's formulation, provides a potent rationale for inaction in situations where action might otherwise seem morally and politically incumbent. One notable effect of conspiracy theory in authoritarian circumstances, in other words, is to create a world where not where truth does not exist, but where finding it is too exhausting for citizens, encouraging them to relinquish judgment to the state or whatever website has the most seductive narrative, or to their own sense of political paralysis. Confusion becomes an alibi for non-judgment, a phenomenon much in evidence today in many parts of the Middle East, in Orban's Hungary, Brazil under Bolsonaro, and arguably in Trump's United States. For generations in the US, to be accused of being a conspiracy theorist has been to have one's perspective developed the serious, the deranged, the untrustworthy, even the pathological. I want to pause for a moment here to consider how problematic such designations can be. While not denying the distinction between rigorous theoretical discourse based consciously on some substantial empirical exercise and the nonstop conspiratorial rumor-mongering on Rush Limbaugh or InfoWars or MSNBC's version of Russiagate or in Bashar al-Assad's Syria or Sisi's Egypt or a host of other contemporary contexts, seriously thinking through a world in which the idea of conspiracy has such traction invites a substantive, I think, intellectual interrogation of the important elective affinities between disciplined theorizing and conspiracy theory. In other words, what I am suggesting here is that there are an array of unavoidable epistemological limitations that characterize contemporary political life, making it difficult to find the appropriate interpretive voice for engaging the local effects of global political problems. Anthropogenic global warming, a consolidated effect of more than a century of petrochemical capitalism, was well understood by big oil as a cost of doing business as early as the 1980s. Exxon, Shell, and other oil giants made corporate decisions in the early 1990s to gaslight the public on a planetary scale, to obfuscate the environmental sciences their own research team had produced, to identify PhDs for hire, some of whom hailed from fields with no relationship to the environment, and to deploy them to dispute the findings of climate scientists. The actual fact of conspiracies raise the important question of how to disagree with and resist the ideological recruitments of the moment. How to assess the veracity of governmental actions when they're cloaked by national security protocols. How to expose corporate programs that rig scientific debates to produce the most profitable answers. Or, to put this differently, accusing a given line of thought of being a conspiracy theory opens a complex rather than self-evident political field, as Masco and I underscore. For generations, the term has been weaponized to discount, dismiss, and contain people's expression of what they're actually experiencing in their lives and what they're trying to understand based on limited information. The charge figures prominently in dismissals of people's claims that the state uses its powers to surveil citizens, misdirect debate, and kill with impunity, even as the state is and has been doing just those kinds of things. Now, one reason conspiratorial narratives are easily marginalized stems from practices of state secrecy, which create a de facto alibi for officials engaged in anti-democratic behavior, such as police violence or financial corruption or simple lousy policy making. While critics experience the effects of such actions, they're barred access to substantial documentation, or they lack the credentials required to make their charges credible or authorize legal standing to bring a case. So they wind up feeling disempowered and not infrequently find themselves cast as irrational subjects into the bargain. Thus, for every anti-vaxxer denying the value of biomedicine or 9/11 truther insisting that the US or the Mossad bombed the World Trade Center to unlock a new world order, views few of us in the room would likely embrace, a vast section of the population routinely experiences material and psychic distress, left to do what they can to survive in a violent world while not trusting officials who are known to lie or experts who are frequently bought or mass media, the business of which is to propagandize for profit. Recognizing and appreciating this psychic distress and people's desire to connect the dots suggests the possibility of aligning the complex political field of conspiracy theory with the no less complicated but generally more rigorous and less malign discipline of critical theory. Understanding that what I have just described may sound like yet another possibly dubious effort to connect disparate dots, or in Susan Lepselter's terms, to indulge in a scholarly apophenia, Joe Masco and I note that historically, conspiracy theory and critical theory share important parallels. The Engram citational study from Google Books shows that the terms conspiracy theory and critical theory emerged together as textual concerns in the 1960s, mirroring each other as modes of interpretive assessment. Eve Sedgwick identified at the time what she saw as a paranoid style of reading among scholars, and the idea continues to inform what is still called critical theory, in that the project is to excavate the deeper truths beneath the surface of mere appearances, an inherently conspiratorial approach to social life and meaning. Engaging in interpretation of this type, according to Walter Benjamin, is to brush history against the grain, in revealing how unconscious normative structures of inequality inform people's understanding of history, politics, and economy. The critical aspects of theory in this formulation lies in the imperative to mobilize readers by activating an analytic narrative that reveals the structural violence concealed within an existing social order in hopes of improving its future condition. The implicit assumption of critical theory is the most powerful forms of injustice and violence are loaded into the everyday, built into the infrastructures of production and consumption, governance and media, institutions and identitarian categories, and for that reason become naturalized and included, made into powers determining people's prospects from behind the scenes. The effects of structural violence in this view are intense, even though sometimes hidden, as well as networked and powerful, which is to say, properly conspiratorial. So, Joe Masco and I frame the problem as conspiracy/theory, addressing that moment when what individuals know or think they know about public life, the utility of theory and the logistics of apparent conspiracies touch directly on people's ability to come to a shared recognition of their collective worlds that they want to live in. Our project attempts to forge a shared diagnostic understanding of the worlds people actually experience themselves inhabiting. And in this spirit, it's worth exploring in greater detail some key terms. First one is conspiracy. Conspiracy refers to acts undertaken in secret by people pursuing some gain. While the behavior in question is often marked as illicit or criminal, as I've been discussing, conspiracy also describes any activist project to change or improve the world. Etymologically, it means breathing together. To conspire is to breathe together, and thus has as its core notion some version of solidarity. As a political practice, Dimitri Kasimis has shown, conspiracy reaches back to ancient history, informing early debates about the very possibilities for and limitations of democracy. And as both idea and practice, it continues to thrive in a well-documented form, or well-documented forms across the political and social spectrum, from revolutionary plotting against the state to criminal activity to governmental activity. The list of such high-order subversive state and corporate conspiracies go on, but as Kimberly Ban argues, conspiracy also has an inherent, undeniable element of fugitivity, a departure from some established social code or norm, whether in the case of nefarious military or imperial projects or revolutionary social collectivities. From this point of view, a world without conspiracy is also a world without the possibility of liberation, without the possibility of reimagining potentials and possibilities without justice. Criminal or social, well or ill-conceived, conspiracy is ultimately inconceivable absent an element of the fugitive. It presupposes a collective working in violation of the norm or out of the public eye, and thus relieved of formal governance. Conspiracy might then be regarded as a fundamental point of origin for world-making, a condition of any progressive response to imperialism, white supremacy, indigenous dispossession, dictatorial rule, and systemic forms of global inequality. Theory Third term, advances propositions about the social or material structure of things in the form of critical theory is what we're leveraging here. It draws on Marxism and psychoanalysis to unpack political economy as a psychosocial order. Coined initially by the Frankfurt School, as most of you know, in the 1930s, the term critical theory has in the meantime come to connote a wide range of analytic approaches which work with differences between surfaces and depths to expose social practices, texts, and mass-mediated forms. The aim of critical theorists to varying degrees is to demonstrate the reality of hidden truths, which often enough are found hiding in plain sight. The effect of critical practices in this view is to attune us to what we already know, or to make visible what has been masked. Spanning profound and generative disagreements, the core concepts of critical theory are analytic reason and immanent critique, the combination of which, along with the attention to the minute and contradictory aspects of social and textual practice, hold the promise of at least a diagnosis of our social conditions and perhaps even egalitarian improvement. The promise of critical theory has always been that authoritarian and imperialist formations can be understood, if not necessarily avoided, via critical assessment and public exposure. Conspiracy theory is likewise an analytic. It's a mode of speculative appraisal undertaken with the goal of understanding manifest conditions while lacking access to all the necessary data. Sometimes the data exists but are kept secret, and sometimes the data are lacking because the situation is unknowable. And sometimes the data are lacking because, whatever the conditions of the not known, rather, however, conspiracy has at its center elements of intuition, anticipation, projection, and investment. In current usage, it merges hyperbolic modes of fantastical narration with the considerable set of survival skills needed to navigate a permanent warfare, plutocrat-dominated, and climate-disrupted world. As a mode of thinking, conspiracy theory might be prone to error in its interpretive conclusion, but it remains an analytic, a way for reason to be alive in a world experienced as the target of both long and slow violence. The connecting element here between critical and conspiracy theory lies in how the latter seeks to activate attention, to recruit others to adopt its particular interpretive frame, to see the world the same by seeing it differently, with the promise of overcoming the opacity and historical embeddedness of powerful entities. Conspiracy theory, in addition to being a mobilization of reason, is also a survival tactic, a mode of deliberation and intuition that the relatively powerless frequently find is a necessary form, a way to break free of normative political imaginaries and to foment new futurities. By insisting on the slash in conspiracy/theory, which both separates and unites the term, the idea here is to facilitate exploration of the analytic overlap between critical theory and conspiracy theory. The slash puts the focus on this overlap as an epistemological dilemma, establishing a standpoint from which we interrogate more generously the analytic challenges of life in a mass-mediated and hyper-violent society in which powerful forms of exclusion, dehumanization, and environmental destruction have been normalized. The slash invites consideration of the terms as imbricated in each other. Doing so means considering how narrative frames specific social and political forms and distinct agendas of world-making can be reciprocally constitutive, suggesting a review of prevailing assumptions found in both academic discourse and political life. Identifying the conditions for knowing in a world beset by too much and too little information at the same time. Conspiracy/theory asks how and when characteristics such as intuition, viewpoint, experience, and anxiety become marked as either conspiratorial or theoretical, and what this authorization or dismissal does to the stories we tell ourselves. By understanding the elective affinities between conspiracy and theory while appreciating their respective seductions, a balance can be drawn from discounting others' experiences and empathizing excessively, allowing us to grapple simultaneously with the ways in which suspicion, opacity, networks, uncertainty, silencing judgment, affect, and mass media function. We can do this, I submit, without denying the fact that some conspiracy theories are preposterous. Part 3, shorter part, almost finished here, the freedom to lie. Appreciating the libidinal charge and fantasy registers that give conspiratorial thought its traction leads us to think specifically about Trump's popular appeal. Consider his titillating emancipation from presidential gravitas, the rule of law, diplomatic decorum, the obligation to respect facts, or even literacy, cf. Covfefe. Trump's populism was successful in circumstances in which a great many average citizens felt profoundly disaffected from the polity, and in which pent-up outrage was available to motor an intense identification with Trump's emotional freedom, as Lauren Berland and Aaron Schuster have each argued. Trump was free to say and do what he wanted, to voice racist thoughts, to bully those he identified as weaklings, to express pornographic desires out loud, to make fun of disabled people, to use the coffers of the state for private gain, for grift, and to lie. I want to consider the case of the Trump presidency here in this final part of the talk as a vehicle for a renewed exploration of the general, consistently fragile relationship between truth and politics. At the same time, I want to use Hannah Arendt's rich and complicated essay, Truth and Politics, to shed some light on our current conundrums posed by Trump's presidency and its aftermath, both in the United States but also in a global context. Through his reliance on lying in the circumstances that is at once tolerated, indulged, disparaged, and frankly, made for most of us exhausting. Although fake news and lying in politics precedes, of course, 2016 and the presidential campaign and Trump's presidency, the Pulitzer Prize-winning watchdog PolitiFact notes that, quote, no other major politician, I assume they're meaning in the United States here, has a worse record for accuracy, with more than 70% of his claims rated mostly false, false, or pants on fire. Or to put this differently, something threatening to the United States' already anemic democracy has happened in the context of Trump's ascension to power and the particular kind of mendacity that thrived and continues to thrive. And although the corrosion of factual truth through mass dissemination is aided by technological innovations, it can't be reduced to them. Rather, it's the combinatory power of technology and political populism, the libidinal destructive registers of fury, disgust, and desire for revenge toward prevailing corrupt institutions that has brought forward a leader whose blatant disregard for facts has so much to tell us about what facts are and their stakes for politics. In Truth and Politics, Hannah Arendt contends that, quote, the politically most relevant truths are factual, unquote. Politics is a domain of plural contingent opinions, argues Arendt, where the understanding of freedom is rooted in an appreciation of the human capacity for speech and other kinds of action, and the establishment, maintenance, and disputation of what counts as a fact is an important part of sustaining political life. As the political theorist Linda Zerilli underscores, facts are also the most imperiled, the most vulnerable to human mendacity and to the pursuit of narrow political interests. Arendt wrote, and I'm quoting here, the chances of factual truth surviving the onslaught of power are very slim indeed. It's always in danger of being maneuvered out of the world, not only for a time, but potentially forever. Facts and events, she continued, are infinitely more fragile than axioms, discoveries, theories, even the most wildly speculative ones. Produced by the human mind, they occur in the field of ever-changing affairs of men and need to be safeguarded. Facts are also contingent. They speak to political potentiality, the "it could have happened otherwise" of commitment. All of the possibilities that didn't happen when something did. She writes, quote, "Facts have no conclusive reason whatever for being what they are. They could always have been otherwise, and this annoying contingency is literally unlimited. It is because of the haphazardness of facts. Facts are the product of the killing off by definition of a myriad of other potentialities inherent in a situation," unquote. Facts, despite being vulnerable, are also stubborn, according to Arendt, so that airbrushing Trotsky out of images of the Russian Revolution or denying that George Washington died in 1799 neither makes Trotsky a non-participant in the revolution nor Washington immortal. She writes, "Unwelcome opinion can be argued with, rejected, or compromised upon, but unwelcome facts possess an infuriating stubbornness that nothing can move except plain lies. Part of the freedom in lying is it does that work of removal." While opinions and facts aren't strictly speaking antithetical, and both are important to political thinking, they do live in some tension. Arendt speaks considerably about factual truth because of its centrality to politics. She's decidedly less interested in the truth of philosophical a priori propositions and more interested in the world-making capacity of human beings. She prioritizes the possibilities for judgment that living in the messy world of human opinions and their uneasy relation to factual truth bring to bear on the situation. For Arendt, exercising this human capacity presumes intersubjective relations of a sort that depend on what she calls representative thinking. Political thought is representative. I form an opinion by considering a given issue from different viewpoints, by making present to my mind the standpoints of those who are absent. That is, I represent them. This process of representation does not blindly adopt the actual views of those who stand somewhere else and hence look upon the world from a different perspective. This is a question neither of empathy, as though I tried to be or feel like somebody else, nor of counting noses and joining a majority, but of being and thinking in my own identity where actually I am not. The more people's standpoints I have present in my mind while I'm pondering a given issue, and the better I can imagine how I would feel and think if I were in their place, the stronger will be my capacity for representative thinking, and the more valid my final conclusions, my opinion. What Arendt describes here, Immanuel Kant called an enlarged mentality, or more precisely, as elaborated by Linda Zerilli, an enlarged manner of thinking whose condition of possibility is not the faculty of understanding, but imagination. Arendt's imagination is an alternative to liberal forms of judgment, both in the Habermasian sense of being rule-bound and the Rawlsian quest for a decontextualized original position. It may be a bit vague, but that doesn't affect its appeal as an invitation to reach some form of impartial judgment by fostering one's imaginative capacity to embrace human interdependence. And that interdependence is itself made up of matters of opinion, which are truly discursive in the sense of an idea, and I'm quoting here again, running, as it were, from place to place, from one part of the world to another, through all kinds of conflicting views until it finally ascends from these particularities to some impartial generality, unquote. Itself open to further negotiation and informed by factual truths which, though never are obscure, are not transparent either. We can explore Arendt's emphasis on the centrality for politics of factual truth rather than philosophical ones more deeply by thinking about how empirical propositions work. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein teaches us that the truth of certain empirical propositions belongs to our frames of reference. Continuing, quote, "When we first begin to believe anything, what we believe is not a single proposition. It is a whole system of propositions. It's not single axioms that strike me as obvious. It's a system in which consequences and premises give one another mutual support, unquote. And arguably, what we're seeing in the US today is the erosion of these frames of reference, and with it the wearing away of truth in Arendt and Wittgenstein's sense. Not the truth of philosophical a priori principles, but the political truth that comes of exchanging empirical propositions, by which I mean what counts for purposes of politics and political discourses as matters of fact. Wittgenstein's insistence that our beliefs make sense to us because of the relational system in which they're embedded points directly to the difficulty involved in judging evidence or accessing truth claims in conditions where nearly every day brings another scandal. Inured to scandal, beset by contradictory information swirling continuously at unheard levels and speed, it's easy for people to lose their sense of moral outrage. People who otherwise might be available for political activation no longer respond to being addressed, as standards of political judgment come unmoored from the conceptual systems in which they were formally situated. Some responsibility for this situation surely falls to journalistic failings and the collusion between media capital's need to generate profit and, say, the Trump administration's penchant for lies and scandal. Or we can think of lies as symptomatic of new reading and writing habits cultivated in conditions of high-speed eventfulness and information overload. The forms of engagement and inattention that affect us all as we attempt, albeit haphazardly, to keep up with the news while being peppered by advertisements and TikTok videos. We are in the age of an attention hack. To conclude, what I have called the temporality of high-speed eventfulness, or the sheer velocity with which information is transmitted and apprehended in the internet age, leads to the forms of discursive oversaturation and epistemic murk this presentation has described. The unceasing whirl of over-information makes it easy for people to move on to something new the instant a favored narrative fails. Attempts to develop more radical narratives in these conditions, either through direct propaganda campaigns or by leveraging ideas put into circulation by others, face previously unseen challenges. Stories are either easily knit into the narrative fabric of stories people are already telling themselves, or their political exuberance is flattened, in the latter case ending up in doubt and disillusion. This atmospherics of doubt is part of what Slavoj Žižek calls systemic violence, which in the United States case operates in cahoots with other forms of disciplinary management to undermine, but not fully foreclose, possibilities for sustained widespread movements of political activism. From this angle, we see people living in the interstices of longings for intense desire and states of disaffection. Regimes, cultural producers, civil society organizations, and micro-political encounters produce an affective environment that complicates the fundamental binary between belief and unbelief, where people behave as if they know something and they don't know it at the same time, or they feel one thing and know something else. These conditions of apprehension in the sense of anxiety, but also comprehension and capture, are part and parcel of authoritarian politics today, even in nominally democratic spaces, and they help constitute one major attraction of Trumpism, the freedom to lie candidly. Thank you.
Fascinating on so many levels. I have a lot of questions, but I'm not gonna, I mean, I can hog my role as or I could take, if there are pressing questions from the floor, we could begin with that, and then, is that it?
Thank you for a challenging talk. A very polished talk, even if a lot of it went over my head personally. But my question is, a big feature of Trump was the deep state. So how does that work into your system of conspiracy and lies and stuff like that? And the bigger question is, what about social ontology, which underlies this? Is it a single one, a flat one between Trump's America and Syria, or is it a kind of more jagged world?
I'll start with the second one because it's both easier and harder than the first one. It's certainly more jagged. There's no sort of one-size-fits-all situation here. But I want to resist the vocabulary of ontology. I actually want to think genealogically. I want to think historically. I want to think around questions of ideology, whereas Althusser once said, ideology has no history, by which he meant the form has no history. But dialectically, the form relies also on its content, and so it's very important for us to understand the specificity of places and cases, even while we understand some things to be general. So I want to make sure that, whatever I'm doing here is attentive to the specificities, even when I can understand the workings of ideology as form, as being cross-historical, in the sense that ideology works through containment, displacement, and disavowal. But the content of that containment, the ways in which those fantasy bribes, to reiterate Jameson's term, are activated and make sense, are of course going to be very different across different areas of the world in different time periods, even in different regions. So we don't only have to think nationally as well. What matters in the Appalachian part of the United States is not what matters in Manhattan necessarily, or is not what is going to necessarily activate people in Manhattan. But one of the things that I think is crucial to understand is that one doesn't have to believe something in order for it to be powerful. And it doesn't just have to be powerful, as my first book suggested, through producing the kind of disciplinary mechanisms of social control, like enforcing obedience, inducing complicity, by exploiting people's unbelief. What I'm trying to do here, and it is beholden to my third book, is to think in a more complicated way about the ways in which we can believe something and not believe something at the same time, where our interests are contradictory. If you want to call that fact of our interests are contradictory, that we need to look for incoherence, inconsistencies, and if we want to think of that as ontology, it would be a very thin version of ontology. And I prefer to think about that as a kind of generalization one can make out of specificity, or a kind of tacking between theory and a grounded world. The first question about the deep state. The deep state is actually a perfect example of what I'm trying to talk about in a way, because, Trump is tapping into people's anxieties about the deep state. There is a deep state, or at least there are instances of deep state behavior, so he's not wrong, but he's opportunistically related to it. But the reason that can have the traction it has, in part, is because conspiracy theory in that context is resonant, and it makes sense to people. It is a kind of connecting of the dots that has experiences in people's real world of understanding. And in the context of the sort of technological innovations that have global implications, that kind of epistemic murk, I think, tends to prompt people to think in deep state terms even more so than they might have before. But the deep state does exist in certain ways. And the peculiarity or the irony for somebody like me is, under the Trump administration, I wanted more deep state, not less. And so what do you do with that conundrum?
Yeah, yes.
Hi, thank you for a very rich talk. I wanted to ask about why you're discounting the concept of false consciousness from this analysis, and also how you're thinking about the relationship between contingency and determination because you kind of, it seems like you know, the context is socially determined, or the legibility of conspiracies is socially determined, but at the same time you state that facts are contingent. So I'm just curious about.
Yeah, I'm going to start with your second one first as well. I want to say that the legibility is socially understandable, it's comprehensible, and it's structured. I don't think it's determined. And I do always think there are the kind of, it could have been otherwise of a situation, that there are these hypothetical ifs that fork out in different directions. That isn't to say that everything is radically contingent. No, there are formidable challenges, say, to social transformation that we have to be able to recognize if we care about something like social determination, transformation. Haha, the unconscious is a cunning beast. But I think that my fidelity to a certain kind of structure is not the same as a commitment to determination. The first question about false consciousness, well, I sort of think about it in the way that Zizek invites us to think about it, that there's no outside from which to judge any, you know, the world as, or these other groups as simply being in false consciousness. We're always operating within a structuring logic of ideology. How the uptake of that is uneven and unevenly saturating. And I think that's important for your second question around, say, contingency. Having said that, I do think that there are, what I do want to hold on to is there are false statements, but I don't think it's actually productive to think about false consciousness because it lends an analysis to think pejoratively as opposed to understand. And there are so many more interesting ways to think about consciousness than to simply declare it false. So on the level of pejorative, invidious distinctions that such an account necessarily, I think, invites, and also from the point of view of an analysis that does justice to the complications of our political and social lives, I prefer not to use the term false consciousness, but to open up the relationship between knowledge and affect and knowledge and action.
Thomas, do you want to?
Thank you for the talk. I very much enjoyed your what you said about conspiracy theory, and I'm interested in political imagination. Specifically, you have this moment in U.S. history. Sort of, there's this economic decline. People are sort of feeling the weight of neoliberalism, and so on, blah, blah, blah. And you have people on 4chan boards spreading these conspiracy theories that are then repeated by figures like Trump. And yet you also have the quote-unquote conspiracies of the activists, say the Starbucks unionizers, people unionizing Starbucks and so on. So I guess I was wondering, could you help me understand the sort of difference in how political imagination and what is understood as politically possible, how that changes, what's the sort of quality of difference between that which is imagined from conspiracy theories from, say, 4chan boards versus that's what's imagined from, like, labor organizing or sort of more leftist projects?
Yeah, well, one of the things the talk is trying to do is to say that there are more affinities than we tend to give the different kinds of activities credit for. And so that both labor organizers or, folks who are on some sort of 4chan or are complementarily related to Q or whatever, that that those folks desire, in common, understandably, a way of connecting the dots, of making sense of the world. They live in similar but not coterminous worlds of epistemic murk. There is a kind of fugitivity to both of what they do. Not everything they do is going to be in public. And there is the pleasure that is taken from being with others in solidarity building or conspiring situations, the fun of breathing together. Having said that, I sign up for the Starbucks organizers politically, and I don't think that it's a problem to do that, especially when one takes the invitation that Arendt gives us to work imaginatively through representative thinking seriously. So what does that mean? You know, I am being myself in a place I am not. I saw Syrian filmmakers do this a lot during the revolution. I see this all over the world in various and varied capacities. But it's like you're in somebody else's shoes, and you know they're not your shoes. You don't pretend they're your shoes. You feel around with them with the curiosity that is incumbent upon you as somebody who's wearing someone else's shoes, nor do you run away with them. This isn't a kind of hyper-identification with somebody who celebrates Q. But it is a recognition that to simply discount them as opposed to try to understand, and to understand not simply from the kind of vantage point of disparagement, but also, again, from a sense of curiosity, a certain kind of modesty, if you will, might be helpful. You know, I was having a conversation with somebody on the plane on the way over who turned out to be a real Trump supporter, and it's like, oh my gosh, I wish if he was upsetting me so much, I wasn't taking notes, I was on the plane or whatever. But one of the things that, he was pretending to listen to me, maybe he was listening to me, I was listening to him, but really wanting to take notes and sort of thinking him as an object of my inquiry at the same time, a little creepy on that level. And I'm like, how can I practice representative thinking in this circumstance? Because I hate this guy right now, I really do. And how can I do it without pity or without that empathy that is appropriative in its own right, and try to understand where that person is coming from, what kinds of, commonalities we share in spite of differences, including commonalities of thought. He assumed that because I was a progressive that I liked Biden, for example. Well, that, is as false as, some of the other more, kind of wacky things he was suggesting. There were sort of points of commonality or meeting places that I found opened up for me as a result of operating with the kind of enlarged mentality, to use Kant's version of things again. Not to say that I would sign up for this person or accept this person. On the contrary, I am me in a place where I am not.
Maybe I can jump in here.
Yeah.
So the question that kind of has been running through my mind in what you're saying, of course, I mean, in a way, the kind of psychoanalytic position in this would be that, obviously the truth always lies in the guise of fiction. That's kind of Lacan's famous, So, I mean, there's a truth in conspiracy theory. Obviously, if we're able to somehow position ourselves in the place to hear it or listen to it in a way, or maybe in a non-Arendtian, let's say, non-Arendtian resolution, one could say, if I don't disavow that you have an unconscious and function in similar mechanisms, perhaps I could do this, whatever, put myself in your shoes or so on. But I think the comment or the question that kind of presents itself is that it seems like, why was this Trump phenomenon so massive? Like, why was it so you could think, I mean, and, I always say this to my students, like in Beirut, in Lebanon, we have 19 of him, right? I mean, it's not like we've always had 19, if not more, right? So it's not, but what was it that was so massive? I mean, one, let's say the place of America on a global stage, but also second, in a certain sense, that there was a kind of a fig leaf that had fallen in relationship to the democratic process. I mean, the concern that I have, I suppose, about the kind of resorting to judgment as a place to kind of somewhat try to stitch up this implosion that has happened, right? While also recognizing the work of affect, because as you said rightly so, ideology is not just about knowledge and discourse, but there's also this added element, the affective, the ambiguous, these other things that seem to be what the reactionary, they're not all right, but perhaps the reactionary to the right, all this politics globally seems to be able to bank on, to mobilize these affects in a way that the other position is incapable of doing or has not figured out how to do. So I guess my question is it seems to me that you have a more felicitous kind of position in relationship to deliberative democracy. I mean, in a way. Maybe I'm misreading here in a way, in the sense to kind of say if we can introduce some kind of element into the deliberative process that allows for an expansion of imagination, that somehow we can hope to fix this situation, right? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm more pessimistic. I think. Oh,
I'm so pessimistic. I don't mean to be anything, but I think it's going to be a disaster. And the fact that one could be so relieved by somebody like Biden coming to power is already symptomatic of the horror, including the horror that awaits us with, this next election campaign. So I certainly don't want to sign up for liberal democracy. I do want to sign up for an appreciation in Arendtian terms of the kind of struggle and contestation that's born out of an appreciation for, but also fear of human plurality. And it's both of those things. And it is a recognition of people's unconscious. It is a recognition of the kind of incoherencies, not only between affect and knowledge, but within one's affective economies as well. So I think that those are very important points. Deliberative democracy doesn't even think about affect. Deliberative democracy is really about, and I think there's something disingenuous about at least the writing on deliberative democracy, because really what it is doing is trying to rechannel people's anxieties and fears into acceptable forms of discourse, institutionalizing them in ways that say don't grapple honestly with class antagonism, for example. And so you're right to point out, and I did say at the beginning, and I think in a longer piece I would do more with this, there are good sociologists who have tried to tackle this. What has happened to the American dream and the kind of forms of class consciousness that it initially, attempted to smooth out or contain by putting forward images of the American dream, for example, and so and Lauren Berlin, of course, writes very persuasively in Cruel Optimism about the ways in which people are attached to forms of living that are no longer doing affirming work for them. Part of that is a class story about the demise of the Rust Belt, about the suppression of wages, these kinds of things, about racial hostility, ongoing racial hostility that has some economic dimension to it, but isn't simply economic in its orientation, the history, the legacies of slavery, the kind of fantasy of the American melting pot and the backlashes towards that kind of assimilative story over time. I mean, a lot is going on there that would be in an analysis that would say take the social more seriously from the get-go. As I said, I'm not doing this today. The other part is I do think, and this is what my colleagues and I was being a little disparaging of political science, but colleagues who work on party politics, have traced, say, what's happened to the Republican Party and the emergence of the Tea Party as a kind of answer to a kind of widespread disaffection in the United States, and the ability to capitalize on that, literally. The Democratic Party, with its uninspiring candidates ad nauseum, really a puzzle in and of itself. I think, this is probably too simple an answer, but they actually have superdelegates, which is a gatekeeping function that actually bars a number of would-be more exciting, populist-oriented candidates from ever getting to a kind of national scene, or certainly in being able to run for presidency. So their gatekeeping policies undermine democracy from the get-go. So I think there's an institutional and narrow political sciencey institutional story to tell. I think there's a much broader social kind of economic political economy story to tell. That latter story, I would argue, also needs to be told in relationship to questions of attachment. But I don't want to be a deliberative Democrat. If I sound like that, I gotta.
No, I mean, this is, but I mean.
Yeah, but it's great.
Yeah.
It's great to, also.
I mean, it's a tension. I mean, how do you say? It's I mean, obviously, it's a point of tension.
Yeah.
Because it's not,
Exactly.
In what you were presenting, there's a tension around that. It's not simply.
Completely true. And the other thing I guess I would say there is, it could have been otherwise, or these hypothetical ifs that work out in all directions, however one wants to put it. The capacities for a certain kind of creative estrangement through which some kind of activism can emerge and new forms of thinking can emerge. I don't mean to sound as Pollyannic as that sometimes can sound. I in some ways, I'm much more attracted to, in this moment, the register of tragedy. And folks like David Scott, for example, who, lamenting the end of a kind of revolutionary period, and he's speaking about Grenada and Maurice Bishop's execution, but thinking more generally also about, thinking temporally about the demise of a progress narrative and what that means politically for the left. Then there are folks who are like, there's no reason to have leftist melancholia, that doesn't allow us to actually think politically. I think it is a condition of thinking politically that we actually sit with our leftist melancholia. I think it's irresponsible not to. And I should say that Arendt, so we have this little pregnant pause here, that Arendt was writing much more in a tragic register than, and I think is sometimes misunderstood in that way. One of her attractions to and friendships with Walter Benjamin had to do with their sharing of that register. And in her famous introduction to Benjamin's Illuminations in Part 3, where she talks about Benjamin as a pearl driver going to the Tempest, and that what has happened, what happens to the pearl diver as they go down and actually recover a lost treasure, not in order to revive the thing that is lost, but to appreciate its loss and bring something new through that loss. And I think that's kind of the way I'm trying to think these days.
Questions? It's more about actually Lebanon.
Yeah.
I need the microphone. I'm very loud. It's okay.
It's being recorded.
Oh,
so,
sorry.
Yeah.
What's interesting is if you ask a person in Lebanon, they're huge supporters of Trump. And all this intimidation that we read about and foreign policies that he had don't really help tiny little Lebanon. So I wanted to just see your view on it because you're very familiar with the region. What's your opinion on that in terms of what is it about him that made him so popular in this country specifically? Anybody you ask, they're like, oh, yeah, he's great. Okay.
Yeah, well, I do think that the the part at the end, and I'm beholden to Aaron Schuster and Lauren Berlant for these insights, the kind of identification with Trump's freedom, the libidinal charge that gives him and people who soak it up, I think is very important to this story, both in parts of the United States and in parts of Lebanon too. That freedom to lie, that freedom to say not necessarily what he means, but to act as though he means it, that freedom to say things other people think but couldn't or wouldn't say, that kind of unbridled masculinity, I think is extraordinarily important and has, cross-regional uptake for sure. And it's true that it's hard to imagine, like, Trump's policies vis-a-vis the Middle East were, in many ways grotesque. In every way grotesque. U.S. foreign policy is grotesque, so you're operating within a long history there. But there was something about his libidinal charge that gave him a kind of, it seems to me, traction or force that had an appeal that others might not have had. Whether that's related to also, complexities around, misogyny, class consciousness, etc., racism, these things don't travel as well to different regions. But the fact of that sort of freedom in the context of a very structured world where expectations around decorum are set, I think is something that could be read as emancipatory for a number of people worldwide, including people who hate him. Yeah. Question.
I wanted to ask a question.
Please.
So in the past few weeks in Lebanon, we've been having pretty interesting, not in a good way, increase in the discourse that says that Syrian refugees are like the problem, as in the main issue that are driving dispossession of the population here. And we've been having meetings whether as people who want to do something about it, and I think there's this point where you analyze what's going on, as in what the right wing is trying to do and their different strategies, but then if you don't offer an alternative way of dealing with the anxiety that people, end of the day, even if I tell them or engage with them, we reach an agreement that, okay, but I have this anxiety about the situation that invites us to necessarily need to deal with it for them, or I need to provide an alternative way of dealing with the anxiety, and I cannot just reach a point where let's stop at it, as if they ask me oh, so what are you saying, what should we do, what is the leftist project that we need to sign up on, as if there needs to be this organized, already pre-packaged future that you take on and move forward to. But I guess I'm just talking about the difficult position that we'd be in, even when we reach a point with other people who want to take up these ideas as a defense to, oh, what else is there? And they don't want to be the ones who, I guess, are figuring that out, and which is more difficult maybe, to endure this anxiety for longer, I guess, also.
So I actually hear two questions here that are really interesting to think about, and I'd love to hear also from others in the room about sort of what resonates for you around Lebanon at the moment, and what strikes you as fundamentally different or irrelevant, totally cool too. But, if one thinks about this discourse that is blaming Syrian refugees in times of economic, really catastrophe here in Lebanon, that's that's a pretty, common reaction. We've seen it in Turkey, see it in the United States. Black people are often blamed for white people's problems in the United States. That's the way the racial order works there. And, that's a kind of classic example of what I was calling ideological displacement, where you take anxieties and you displace them onto a fantasy other. And that doesn't mean that those others aren't out there, but the other with a capital O is phantasmatic and not, not the people who are refugees who are suffering being in Lebanon. But your second sort of intervention was more about, well, how do I talk to people who are like, well, and you may not be able to, but the kind of representative thinking mode of being is not to give up on your position, but to be open to what it is they're saying to you as a way of strategizing, but also as a way of learning a bit from them. What kind of commonalities might you share? What commonalities you might share that are abhorrent to you, in fact, as well? Not all commonalities are good commonalities to have. What kind of nightmare scenarios, for example, might you also share in common? And what would it take to move this person? And what kinds of things would it take to move you? Exactly. I'm never going to become a white supremacist. In some ways you're pointing, and I think Nadia was doing this too, to a problem with the formulation around representative thinking. It kind of presumes that everyone is willing to do it. And that's really, really hard to imagine or to, think of as but you can still even do it at moments, and this is another thing that makes it different from deliberative democracy kind of arguments. It's an enlarged mentality. You're doing it with yourself as well as others. So to go home and then also be like, okay, now I'm going to put myself in their shoes. What can I understand from this? I wouldn't have understood otherwise. But not with this kind of, again, empathy or hyper-identification. You aren't them. It's not that kind of seductive, narcissistic invitation. It's different than that. And it's very much that you remain Rami when you're doing this. What kind of opening does that allow you? Imagining a kind of polyphonic universe in which each person's voice is heard, albeit not with the same kind of generosity, because some people's voices are gross. Because that's me in somebody else's shoes, not appropriating the gross person's shoes and running away from them. It's actually a harder exercise than it sounds to do.
It's also, and kind of, if I can just, because you interpolated me there, but it's this kind of, this very sticky place that you're describing where kind of sameness and difference are not very well, where love and hate are very deep. Mm-hmm. And, I think Freud has this example of the porcupines, when you huddle together too much and you're forced to be in a society, you're gonna shoot out your needles, right? Your porcupine needles. So, because these are, this very same condition, if one wants to have any lessons from here, is that these are precisely the conditions that generate war. They generate real animosity and aggression, right? So it's a kind of a very, it's a tightrope there, because they're symptomatic. This moment is symptomatic of the complete kind of, how do you say, society dissolving into the state of absolute animosity, and the possibility, as you propose, of perhaps a way to, straddle that antagonism. You go with it somewhere. Yeah, straddle that antagonism. Yeah, exactly. That's great. I see more hands, so I'd love to get more people in there, and then I'll take some final. Yeah, go ahead. Whoever, I think there. Yeah, thank you.
I was just thinking about your question in terms of politics in Lebanon and maybe some resonances, and I was immediately thinking about the time decision and the whole kind of craziness around the time, and immediately as there were these two different existing times in Lebanon, there was discussion of this idea that this is something that was being orchestrated to distract from recent economic reports that were coming out. and thinking about your ideas about information overload and everyday fears, everyday tensions. And here in Lebanon, this example of maybe this idea of conspiracy as not just an authoritarian tool, but an anti-democratic tool that's not necessarily about any one person consolidating authoritarian power, but about keeping like accountability at bay. And maybe just kind of your thoughts on these systems of confusion and conspiracy not just being about authoritarian consolidation, but about being undemocratic in a broader sense. Did you want to?
No.
Okay, these are great questions, and so I don't want to say that conspiracy is simply anti-democratic either. Conspiracy can also be democratic. That's part of the reasons for my efforts to align conspiracy and critical theory to some extent, that there is a way in which neither are democratic and both have aspects of democracy. If you are revealing something like the Tuskegee syphilis project, you are actually bringing into the open something that was a conspiracy behind, but you still have a conspiracy narrative there. It's just the conspiracy is true. So I'm not sure there's any necessary relationship between conspiracy and undemocratic, actually. So I do want to make that the case, and particularly because there is that kind of fugitivity there, where conspiracy coming from to breathe together also suggests certain forms of solidarity making that are, cousins of the democratic, if not, synonyms with the democratic. So I think we have to be a little bit careful there, that there is no necessary connection there. But your other point about information overload, the distractions, the time decision is one absurd instance of it, I think is really important to think about in terms of, the ways in which people in power will distract, the kind of brouhaha or furor that displaces other ways of coming to talk together or imagine worlds in common, or offer a trenchant critique or try out a new idea or experiment in living it. I mean, people are too exhausted to do this, things are too scary to do this, and the kinds of distractions that say the time decision is symptomatic of, I think, it is part and parcel of what we can think about now as a polity on the precipice. And it's not that all of it is directed, but it has the cumulative effect. So, and I do say that although we're now talking about Lebanon, and with the remaining minutes, I would like to continue to talk about Lebanon, a place I care a great deal about as well. I think there are signs that the United States is on the precipice of a civil war as well. It may not take the form that we generally understand to be civil war, but the number of gun deaths a year, the number of both, if you think of this polarized world of, two sides and also innocent civilians getting killed in the mix, the kind of a state overreach that we're seeing, for example, and it's hard to know where that will go. There are, institutions that seem maybe solid enough to forefend against civil war, if not the erosion of democracy. But I think it's too early to tell. So I think there may be even more commonalities here than we would initially allow. One other thing, you said conspiracy the conspiracy keeps accountability at bay. One of the things that the conspiracy part of the talk was also inviting us to think about is the way in which a conspiracy theory can make us accountable. So it does both.